Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Skinwalker encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/Trayprit. I think my neighbor's cat warded off a Skinwalker. My father died about 5 years ago unexpectedly from a heart attack. To say it was hard on my mother and I was an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel like home anymore. About a year later, Mom and I made plans to take ourselves and our elderly dog Ace on a move further south to a small town situated about a half hour from Atlanta. Just a few days before we were slated to move, however, I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever come to experience. All that was within my dream was my bedroom. A picture-perfect recreation of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if I was in some sort of sleep paralysis state when it occurred. To further add to the dream's realism, in the middle of the night the street lights right across the street would illuminate through my window, creating a light reflection on the wall perpendicular. In my dream, as I lay there staring at that exact reflection on the wall, I saw an orb of smoke fade in from the shadows. Goosebumps chilled across my skin, as I lay there panicked and afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly, it stopped moving and steadily hung in the light's reflection, as if it was staring at me. Without warning, it spoke to me, in my dead father's voice. "I'm sending something to watch you." Despite hearing my father's voice come from the orb, I was terrified of it. I didn't know why. And yet, I managed to squeak out a small reply towards it. "What?" I whispered. The orb remained silent for a few moments, leaving an eerily dead silence in the voice's place. Just as quickly, it spoke to me one final time. "Damn. Black." I woke up almost instantaneously, gasping for breath. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, especially those two final words. I chalked it up to maybe Dad wishing us well on our move, but at the time, I couldn't shake the feeling it was some kind of warning. Within the next couple weeks, my mother and I moved out of Knoxville and headed down south to Georgia. She had managed to find a quaint little house for us. With only one or two neighbors down a gravel road in the middle of the woods, it was a nice fit for us. Probably the best reliever of all the stress that came with the move, however, was our new neighbor's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as if she was my own pet. I left out a can of food once or twice a week for her, and even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she would always run up to me. She helped ease my tensions about leaving Knoxville behind, especially without Dad there with us. Less than a month into our new house, I awoke suddenly to a faint coughing noise that sounded like it was coming from downstairs. One important thing to know about our dog Ace is that he has a collapsed trachea. He needs medicine to help calm the condition down, so I'm used to waking up in the middle of the night to give him his medicine. I proceeded downstairs from my bedroom to give him his cough medicine, but I couldn't find him anywhere throughout the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping, he wasn't in the kitchen, he was nowhere to be found. I didn't check Mom's bedroom, however, as to avoid waking her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he had been in there anyway, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the cough again, but it was coming from further away, as if from outside. I looked over at the side patio door leading out into the woodlands, and realized I had forgotten to shut it. There it stood, slightly ajar. Shit, I thought to myself, he got out. I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling out for my dog. "Ace! Ace!" I shouted into the neighboring trees. I heard another cough, and shined my light in its direction. That time, it had echoed from down the gravel road. I swear, a path had never looked so terrifyingly desolate before in my life than that night, as I stared down the same gravel road that had led us to our new home. But in that moment, I thought my dog was lost, and I chalked it up to new house jitters, so I pressed onward. Ace, come on boy. Home's this way buddy. That's when I heard it, the cough that I had been following, almost right beside me. But this time, it didn't stay like the dry cough I had been hearing. Instead, the cough had slowly descended into a low growl. I shined my light towards the new sound. There stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. For a moment, I figured it was some kind of sick fox I had mistaken for my dog. The whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing, it stared directly at me. Its eyes glowed from the light of my flashlight. However, our stare broke when it tilted its head to the right. I looked down, and there she was, our neighbor's little black cat standing beside me. However, it was as if she had completely changed persona. She was no longer the happy, affectionate cat I had come to know. Instead, she had her back arched upright, every fiber of hair standing at attention, and uttered the lowest growl I had ever heard come out of a feline. In that moment, I figured she was just scared of the fox, so I knelt down beside her in a bid to coax her away and avoid the fox hurting her. But no matter how many times I tried to coax her out of fight mode, she wouldn't budge. Her stare remained unfazed. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more, but there wasn't a fox standing there anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot of that gravel road, was a walking, rotting corpse of a roadkill coyote, slowly moving towards me. I took a step back, absolutely horrified of what I was seeing. Its jaw was hanging loose from its face, one of its eyes was stained with blood, and it wobbled back and forth, as if it was desperately fighting pain. I rubbed my eyes out of disbelief, hoping I was imagining it. But it was still there when my eyes reopened. Despite the gruesome sight before us, our neighbor's black cat, no matter how tiny she was, stood there and kept growling at the creature. Suddenly, it stopped. The creature had ceased its walk towards us. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me. That's when I unmistakably heard this beast mutter two solemn words, in a low gravelly voice. Damn. Black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it had completely vanished. Even the brush it had ran through looked untouched. That's when the cat, still standing beside me, calmed herself down. Almost as if nothing had happened, she rubbed herself up against my leg, returning to her normal, loving mood. Despite technically not being mine, I proceeded to scoop her up and run back into the house. Before heading upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up in my arms, I decided to poke my head into my mother's room. Laying on the floor, sound asleep, was Ace. He had been there the entire time. I quietly closed her door, before bolting upstairs. I made sure that little cat slept with me in my bed that night. From the research I've done, I think I was almost the victim of some kind of skinwalker. It must have picked up the sounds my dog sometimes makes late at night, knowing I'd likely come to his aid. For whatever reason, our neighbor's black cat had scared it so badly, it scrambled away. I haven't seen it since that night, maybe because that same cat still likes to wander down the gravel road late at night, or maybe that thing just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, whether I have my father or pure luck to thank, I leave a can of food out every single night for that little black cat. And the most ironic part of it all, that cat's name is Halloween. Second story. This story was shared by you/Cynic Happy. The Singing Skinwalker. This story was told to me by one of my good friends, who's of Navajo descent on her father's side. It happened several years ago, when she was spending the last 2 weeks of summer visiting relatives on a reservation in New Mexico, and is by far one of the creepiest things I've ever heard. My friend, Jessie, was 12 at the time and playing outside with her cousins. They were tossing a frisbee around, and one of the younger kids threw it too hard. It flew over the fence and was swallowed up by a small grove of parched bur oak trees. Jessie, being the eldest, went to retrieve it, leaving her 11-year-old cousin Ellie in charge until she got back. The sun was setting, lighting up the sky in brilliant shades of orange, as Jessie made her way over to the grove. After some poking around, she found the frisbee caught in one of the tree's branches. As she climbed, she began to sing an old Navajo song, but paused when her body suddenly went cold. That's exactly how Jessie described it to me, cold, as if she'd been dunked in ice water. You know that annoying scary story cliché of feeling like you're being watched? Well, it's only cliché because it's true. Jessie could feel a pair of eyes following her even when she looked around her and saw nothing. Seriously creeped out, she grabbed the frisbee and ran back to her grandmother's house, just in time to see the old woman step onto the porch and call for the kids to come inside. The true horror didn't start until several hours later. Jessie, her cousin Ellie, and Ellie's little sister Clara were asleep in their grandmother's guest room when Jessie woke up to the strangest sound she'd ever heard. She described it to me as a cross between radio static and the noise an old movie reel makes. At first, it sounded distant, but after a minute or two, Jessie realized it was getting closer. Beside her, Ellie rolled over and muttered, "What is that?" "Don't know," Jessie whispered. The girls waited, holding their collective breath. By now, the sound was right outside the window, and Jessie realized it was singing. At this point in her retelling of the story, Jessie went white and began glancing over her shoulder. She told me the song was the exact same one she'd been singing in the tree grove earlier. It sounded so wrong, she said, rubbing her arms as if a cold breeze had rushed by her. "Remember when we listened to that clip of the very first recording of a human voice? How weird it sounded." When I nodded, Jessie added, "It was like that, but a little clearer." Somehow, that made it even worse. Jessie and Ellie were both terrified, while Clara, unaware, slept on. Through the thin blue curtain over the window, they could see the dark shadow of something peering in at them. To this day, Jessie can't explain what motivated her to get up and see for herself, since she was scared shitless. Ignoring Ellie's protests, she slid out of bed and walked across the room on shaky legs. As soon as she drew back the curtain, she regretted her decision. Staring back at her was the most horrifying creature she had ever seen. It had the head of an emaciated deer, with antlers like dead tree branches and eyes so black they seemed to absorb the faint silver moonlight. It had a scrawny humanoid body with abnormally long arms and legs, and as Jessie stood there, caught in its hideous gaze, it raised a clawed hand and scratched at the window with a horrible screeching sound that made Jessie's skin crawl. It was Ellie's scream that jolted Jessie out of her terrified stupor. She stumbled back from the window and landed on the carpeted floor. Clara woke up and began screaming too. Then their grandmother ran in and turned on the light. The thing at the window had vanished, leaving behind 3 long scratches in the glass and 3 terrified little girls. Jessie's grandmother managed to calm the hysterical children enough so they could tell her what had happened. As she listened, her age-weathered face became progressively paler. She hustled the girls downstairs to the living room and made up a bed for them on the couch. She then sat by them all night, and whenever one of them asked her what was going on, the old woman simply shook her head. Needless to say, Jessie and her cousins didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jessie's grandmother announced that everyone was to stay inside that day, no arguments. She looked so shaken nobody dared protest. Around noon, she called for a medicine woman to come and bless the house. Later, after the woman left, Jessie marched into the kitchen where her grandmother was loading the dishwasher. "Tell me what that thing was," she said bluntly. Her grandmother sighed and motioned for Jessie to sit down. "You have heard the legend of the Skinwalkers, yes?" Jessie frowned and nodded, vaguely recalling the story. "So that was a Skinwalker?" Her grandmother nodded. "Yes. Grandma," said Jessie as a light dawned, "I think it overheard me singing in the tree grove yesterday." Her grandmother's dark eyes narrowed. "Why do you say that?" "Because it was singing that same song. You know, the lullaby you used to sing to me when I was little." Her grandmother was silent for a long time before whispering, "You are a very lucky girl, Jessica, but luck has its limits. From now on, you must be more careful." The look in the old woman's eyes as she spoke those words still haunts Jessie to this day. As I said earlier, that was years ago, 7, to be specific. Jessie has returned to the reservation many times, each without incident, but she has never set foot in that tree grove again, and probably never will. Jessie's grandmother died this past March, at the age of 87, and Jessie later moved in with her aunt for the summer so she could help clean up the old house, which the family was going to rent out. She had been there for about a week when I went down there to visit her. On my first night, we sat on the porch and drank some beers, and I found my eyes drifting towards the tree grove. So that's where it all happened. Jessie shuddered and nodded. "Yep. Tomorrow, I'm taking you to the medicine woman and have her bless you." "Is that really necessary?" The look Jessie gave me nearly turned me to stone. "You think nothing will happen to you because you're white. But when you're in Navajo territory, you're in Skinwalker territory. Take caution." I nodded. "Yes." That night, I swore I heard radio static outside the house. When I brought it up to Jessie the next morning, she didn't speak, but grabbed my arm and practically dragged me to the medicine woman, where I was blessed. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip, and I went back to the city unscathed. I didn't post this here with the intention of teaching a moral, but I suppose if there is something to be learned from the story of the singing Skinwalker, it's that there are things out there we can't explain. The look in Jessie's eyes when she recounted her experience told me everything I need to know. What she saw truly horrified her, and all I can say is, I'm grateful I didn't have to go through it myself. Third story. This story was shared by you/revolutionary, Mud905. Skinwalkers. I always thought that the legends about skinwalkers were just that, legends. Tales to scare children around campfires, to keep them from wandering too far into the wilderness. But then I came face to face with one, and I realized that they were all too real. It happened when I was out camping in the middle of nowhere, far away from civilization. I had always loved the wilderness, the feeling of being completely cut off from the world. But that night, something felt off. The air was thick and oppressive, and I could hear strange noises coming from the darkness. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like something was scratching at the walls of my tent, trying to get in. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, but I knew deep down that it was something far more sinister. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The air grew still and quiet, and I felt a sense of dread settle over me. That's when I heard the whispering. It was a low, guttural sound, like nothing I had ever heard before. It was coming from just outside my tent, and it seemed to be growing louder and more insistent by the second. I wanted to run, to flee into the safety of my car and drive far away from this place. But something held me back, some morbid curiosity that made me want to know what was out there. And then it happened. The tent shook violently, as if something was trying to tear it apart from the outside. I could hear the fabric tearing, and I knew that I was in mortal danger. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The air grew still and quiet once again, and I was left sitting in my tent, alone with my thoughts. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there, waiting for the sun to rise, listening to the whispers that seemed to echo in my head. And when the dawn finally broke, I knew that I had to get out of there. I packed up my things and got in my car, driving as fast as I could away from that cursed place. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had latched onto me like a parasite. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that wilderness again. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I know that there are things out there that we can't explain or understand. Skinwalkers are real, and they're not just legends. There's something far more terrifying, something that can shatter our understanding of the world around us. And I fear that they're still out there, waiting in the darkness for their next victim. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/group. The Wolf at Skinwalker Ranch. My wife and I were sitting on the front porch after a long day of moving furniture and boxes into our new house. We were tired, red-faced, and sweating after sharing the burden between the two of us. The sun was setting on the horizon as we sipped our warm beers and looked out over the landscape of our newly acquired ranch. Fields stretched off into the distance as far as the eye could see, not a neighbor in sight for miles. The cows were grazing, looking unhappy, their tails hanging straight down as they ignored the fresh grass all around them. I figured they were just upset from the long move. "Why do you think they needed so many locks?" my wife asked, taking a sip of her beer. It was the elephant in the room, so to speak, and I had to admit I was curious about it as well. Every door in the house had a deadbolt on it, inside and out. Not only that, but the windows were shielded by thick iron bars. The old owners had left long before we could ask them about it. The folks who lived here before were probably paranoid about home invasions so far from the city. "We'll take them down and I'll fill the screw holes with wood putty. We'll paint them over and they'll be good as new. You wanted to redo the trim anyway. And the bars on the windows? That'll take a bit more work, but I can get it done before the weekend. I'll just have to run over to the hardware store to grab a few things. I can't find some of my tools, maybe they got lost during the move." My wife was no longer paying attention. She was staring at some point far off in the distance. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. I followed her finger and looked to see a large gray wolf moving in the fields. It seemed to be stalking deliberately toward us, marching at a steady, quick pace. It came to a fence and did the strangest thing. Instead of leaping over it, or burrowing under it, as I'd expected, it stood up on two legs like a person, grasped the loose corner of the wire fencing, and pulled it up, ducking between the strands and stepping through, one leg after the other. It was exactly how I would have done it. Once it was on the other side, it went back on four legs and started its progress toward us again. Then it looked up and saw us staring at it. The gray wolf stayed still for a few seconds, then disappeared in the tall grass suddenly. It was just gone. It didn't dive into the grass or duck down, it was there, and then a moment later it was just gone. Vanished in the blink of an eye. The two of us sat uneasily on the porch and I stood up to look in the distance, trying to spot the creature. But it was nowhere to be found. "I'm going inside." "You should come too," my wife said, sounding nervous. We went in and locked the doors at the front and back of the house. The bars stayed on the windows after that, and my wife didn't mention the deadbolts on the doors in the house again either. The two of us went to bed that night with little talk between us, a big difference from the ecstatic chatter that had been the norm all day prior to the event with the wolf. Or whatever that thing was. I got the feeling wolf was not quite the right word. That night something else even more disturbing happened to us both. I woke up in the early hours of the morning, around 3:30 a.m. according to the bedside alarm clock. When I looked next to me in the bed and saw my wife's spot was empty, I became immediately concerned for her safety. Where could she have gone at this time of night, I wondered. That was when I heard her voice calling to me from outside the window, asking insistently for me to let her in. Her cries for help were muffled through the glass and I lifted the heavy old window pane up to hear her better. "What are you doing out there?" I asked, worried about the wolf we'd seen earlier. I was looking around for glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight nearby. Standing on two legs or four, I wasn't sure which to expect. "I must have been sleepwalking," she said dreamily. "The front door locked behind me somehow. You have to let me back in. Please. It's cold out here." "I'll be right down," I said, without thinking about how impossible all of that was. I was only concerned for her safety at that moment. And she had been known to sleepwalk occasionally, so that part seemed to make sense. I raced down the stairs in my boxers and grasped the front door knob in my hand, turning it. Thankfully, it was locked, or who knows what might have happened. Reaching up to turn the lock, I was startled to hear a voice behind me. "What are you doing?" my wife asked. I jumped at the sound, my heartbeat quickening. But what terrified me even more was what I had just seen outside. Given the time frame it had taken me to get downstairs, it was impossible that it had been her. It was like someone else had been out there, wearing her skin and speaking in her voice. Looking at the woman standing in front of me, I had no doubt it was Christine, my wife. Panting, I walked over to her and hugged her tightly. "What's wrong?" she asked. I didn't answer, afraid she would think I was losing my mind. Some things we don't share with anyone, not even our significant others. We take them to our grave, afraid that if we speak of them out loud it will make them true, and it will make the source of the impossible things return. So instead I just took her hand and led her up the stairs, looking back nervously over my shoulder at the front door, waiting for the sound of a key turning in the lock. Or the sound of it being broken down by powerful forces beyond my control. Instead, there was a gentle knock. Polite almost, at first. But then the fist began to pound against the front door of the house louder and louder, more and more insistently. My wife stopped, turning around to look at me on the stairs. "Who could that be at this time of night?" she asked. "Just ignore it. Let's go to bed. They'll go away, eventually." After a few moments of hesitation, she turned around and began going up the stairs once more, taking a couple nervous looks back as she did. We kept walking up the stairs as the pounding continued, devolving into steady scratching noises that didn't cease until daybreak. "What were you doing down in the basement last night?" my wife asked at the breakfast table the next morning. Neither one of us mentioned the sounds at the door the night before. We were both trying to act like it had never happened. In the light of the morning it seemed like a shared hallucination. A bad dream brought on by warm beer and too much time spent moving boxes without enough assistance. "In the basement?" "I wasn't in the basement," I told her. "Yeah, you were. You were calling my name, asking me to come down there." I looked at her with concern. "When was this?" "Right before I found you at the front door. I figured I just missed you, that you found whatever you were looking for down in the basement and went into the kitchen for a snack or something. But then I found you by the front door. I was never in the basement last night." She looked at me, puzzled. "Of course you were. Who else would have been calling for me from down there?" I debated telling her what I had seen outside and decided I probably should. We were clearly dealing with something very strange here, and we needed to be on the same team if we were going to figure it out. "Christine, did you go outside at all last night?" "No." "What does that have to do with Dash?" "Okay. So, here's the thing. I saw you outside. At the same time when you were going down to the basement. You were calling to me from out front, saying you had been sleepwalking and you were locked out. That's why I was at the door. I never went down to the basement, and I don't think that was really you outside, either. I think there's something else causing all this to happen." "What the hell could cause that to happen?" I opened my mouth to answer when there was a polite rapping at the door. The two of us sat dead silent for a few moments, unsure what to do. The knocking came again, and I heard a man's voice, muffled through the door, saying, "There's a car here. Maybe they're out in the fields." "Should we just leave it on the doorstep?" a woman's voice asked. "I don't like being here any more than you do, but that seems a bit rude. Maybe we should come back." Christine and I both stood up, sensing that this was not the same entity from the night before. I don't know how I could tell, but I just could. This wasn't an evil presence, it was just some neighbors coming by to welcome us. And they sounded like they might know something more than we did about the ranch and its mysteries. I opened the front door and saw a man and woman with their backs turned, walking away from us. They spun around when they heard the sound of us opening up. "Oh, hi there. We're the Turnbulls. We live down the road. Technically next door, as if there is such a thing out here. But we do share an easement with you to access the river. Jack takes the cattle down that way sometimes for a change of scenery." The man put his arm around his wife's shoulder and whispered something in her ear. She abruptly stopped talking, realizing that she was rambling on nervously. "Sharon, I'm sure they don't want to get into all that. We just wanted to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood, so to speak. It's nice to have another couple living next door again. This place has been empty for so long." My wife and I looked at each other with surprise. As far as we knew, the place had been occupied right up until our arrival. It hadn't shown signs of disrepair or neglect, so we'd had no reason to think otherwise. "Really? No wonder the place was such a bargain. How long was it empty for? The man and woman shared a look. Oh, you know. Not that long. A few years. Anyways, we just wanted to bring this casserole. We have a few errands to run, but it was great meeting you both. Come on by our place anytime. We're number 56981, the next driveway on your side, up that way, the man said, hooking his thumb eastward. I had never seen anyone introduce themselves and run so quickly. I tried not to take it personally. It was so nice to meet you both, the woman said, taking a few quick steps towards my wife and handing her the casserole dish. You can keep that dish, by the way. It's Pyrex. Great for casseroles. She backed up to join her husband, looking around the property nervously as she did. Hey, can I ask you something? The two of them looked ready to run back to their car, but they stopped and nodded, shifting on their feet anxiously and waiting for me to speak. Have you ever seen anything? How should I put this? There's been a couple weird occurrences since we moved in and I was just wondering if you could tell us anything. Is this place haunted? Is that why it was so cheap? I can tell you guys are nervous. Just give us something to work with. Please. We're getting a little freaked out. The woman looked pleadingly at her husband. He nodded to her and she went back to the car and got in the passenger seat where she sat darting her eyes around from side to side. What exactly did you see? The man asked. Wait, no. Don't tell me. It's better if we don't speak of them. They know when you talk about them. It's better if we don't. Well then, how do we get rid of them? You don't. These things have been around a lot longer than you or me. My wife and I get our share of strange events on the ranch next door too, but not as bad as here. This place. Well, there's something here that makes it special. And not in a good way, I'm sorry to say. I'd tell you more, but it would only make things worse. It always does. There was a sound of knuckles rapping against the glass and I looked to see his wife banging on the car window, looking with wide eyes at us and pointing into the distance, towards the fields. My eyes followed where she was pointing and I looked to see the large gray wolf was back. And it was moving towards us again. I told you. We're not meant to speak of them. I need to go. The two of you should decide soon if you want to stay. This place will change you. And it will take things from you. You only get so long to decide. If you wait to see what the changes will be, it will already be too late. Trust me. With that he turned away and went back to his car. He started the engine and drove off much quicker than I would have thought, safe on the dirt driveway, swerving and leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air around us, obstructing my view for a few seconds. When I turned around again, the wolf was much, much closer. It was about 50 yards away and closing in fast. It was looking at me intently. My wife was running back towards the house, yelling at me to come, but I was frozen, watching the wolf as it stood on its hind legs again. Not a wolf. Stop calling it a wolf. It's not a wolf. It's just trying to fool you into thinking that's what it is. But it's so much more dangerous than that. I tried to take a step but my legs wouldn't budge. My eyes were locked on the wolf as it began to stalk towards me, no longer an animal but something else wearing an animal suit. The ancient leathery skinned humanoid beneath the wolf armor could be glimpsed occasionally as it strode like a hunter in my direction, taking long steps, moving low to the ground. The fur pieces were simply strapped onto it like clothing, the wolf head strapped on like a hat. "What are you doing? Get in here," my wife yelled one more time, and my foot suddenly started to move. As soon as it did, I found I was unfrozen and finally able to start running, and not a second too soon. The house was close, but the thing was fast. When it saw me beginning to run, it became a wolf again in an instant. The idea that it was anything but that seemed ludicrous as I watched it race towards me on all fours, its snapping jaws dripping saliva as it dove to cut me off. This thing was a massive gray wolf, through and through. It could be nothing but that. And yet my eyes had begged otherwise just a moment before. If not for my wife, it might have gotten me. But she saw what was happening and took a large rock we had been using as a doorstop and threw it straight at the thing's head. It missed, hitting the beast in the shoulder instead, but it was enough to drive it back for a brief second. Which was all I needed. I ran into the house and slammed the door shut behind me. An instant later the scratching began again. Soon there was another one at the back door, scratching it as well. The sounds continued for hours. When the noises stopped and I finally ventured outside again, I found that 3 of the cattle had been killed. The others were scared out of their wits, hiding huddled together in a corner of the field near to the house. Their eyes darted around the fields, reminding me of how the neighbors had looked, as they scanned our property for the things lurking in the shadows. I was beginning to suspect we were not going to be able to stay in this place much longer. Even if we could survive, this was no way to live. That night, my wife and I sat in the living room with all the blinds and curtains drawn, discussing what we would do. The house wouldn't sell quickly, that much was obvious based on the neighbors' statements. The 2 of us decided we would leave in the morning, regardless. We would stay in a motel until we found an apartment to rent, sacrificing all of our investment in the house. Even if we put it up for sale again, it would be a long, long time before we made any portion of our money back. But it was too dangerous and too terrifying to stay. "I'm going to bed," my wife said, looking tired. "Come upstairs soon, okay? I don't want to be alone." "I'll be up in a minute," I told her. "I just want to grab a glass of water." She nodded sleepily and went up the stairs slowly, looking depressed. We had dreamed about this move for so long, and now it was all coming to ruins. I felt sad about it too. I went into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. After drinking it down in one long gulp, I decided I needed another. It had been a long day and I'd been too distracted to drink anything. A noise came from upstairs. A scraping sound like claws. Setting down the glass, I turned around and listened closely. "Christine." She didn't reply. I took a few steps across the linoleum floor of the kitchen before calling out again. Once again there was no answer. By the time I got to the bottom of the stairs, my heart was pounding so fast and hard I felt like it would beat right out of my chest. I opened my mouth to call her name one more time when I saw it. The wolf that wasn't a wolf strode on 2 legs across the gap at the top of the stairs, then disappeared around the corner, heading towards my wife. It was so quick that I thought for a moment I could have imagined it. Just a gray blur that was gone in an instant. If not for the fact that it looked down the stairs at me and smiled, its long canines gleaming in the light. Its eyes were pure blackness. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, terrified of what it would do to her. When I got to the 2nd floor, I looked down the hall to see all of the doors were closed. It was as if the whole thing had really been just my imagination. Taking an unsteady step towards the bedroom, my heartbeat did not slow down even slightly. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob, turning it and entering the master bedroom. I entered hesitantly, finding the room dark and my wife asleep in bed. Part of me wanted to wake her up, but for some reason I didn't. "It will be fine, just go to bed," my irrational thoughts said. My pounding heart began to slow and my eyelids grew heavy. "This is fine," my mind told me. "Everything is fine. Just go to sleep now." Trying not to think of what I had seen just moments before, I climbed into bed, getting in next to my wife and shivering while my body warmed up beneath the sheets. There was a soft sound of padding footsteps outside the bedroom door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Something wants to get inside the bedroom. And a strange, foreign voice in my mind is telling me to let it in. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/physical, speaker, 457. I think my friend is a skinwalker. I've been lurking around on the forums for a while now, and I was about to give up until I found this thread. I've read some similar experiences to my own, so I figured you all would be able to bring more clarity to all of this. This all happened back during this past summer in the state of Kentucky. To protect his identity, and out of respect for his family, I will refer to my friend as James. I was spending time together with James, celebrating his completion of finals and my recent promotion, drinking to our heart's content, and we had the thirst of a Norse warrior at a midsummer festival. Starting with a nice bottle of Japanese whiskey that lasted all but 30 minutes, we moved on to something a little classier, Jim Beam. We sipped until day became night and everything got fuzzy around the edges. James took a long pull off the bottle before he turned to me and asked if I want to go for a night walk to our favorite stargazing spot. I obliged by taking the final swig. This was just one of the things James and I would do every weekend, and surprisingly our parents were okay with it. Ever since we had science class together as kids, we loved stars and outer space, and the clearing was like our own private research facility. We had a large amount of forested area near where we lived, and the clearing was just 1.5 miles into the woods. I would pack my budget telescope and we would get nice views of the moon in its differing phases, as well as nearby planets and visible galaxies. After high school, James had saved up a couple $1,000s to spend on one of those fancy scopes that could be remote controlled and could take HD videos. We would often talk about black holes, the inevitable heat death of the universe, or if there were other Earth-like planets out there with life like ours. We could even recite all the differing spectral types of stars from memory. It was the foundation of our friendship, though James was much more serious and even talked about going to college for a degree in astronomy once he had finished his general education courses at the local community college. He was the only kid from class that said he wanted to be an astronaut and was serious about it. I was content looking at the stars through my telescope from my backyard, beer in hand, and not being in debt. It was a bad idea, but we did not care, and off into the night we went. Along the way there was this drainage ditch we would pass by. Alluring today as it was back then, for no good reason other than it was creepy. Being as inebriated as we were, we took the bait and headed down. Being extra careful to scale down the steep incline of the ditch walls, we made it inside. It was your standard drainage ditch, a large concrete canal stretching out about 10 miles in both directions, dividing the forested land in two. There was an overpass that ran across a small portion of the ditch like a bridge, connecting the two pieces of land so that people could walk across. Along the graffiti-riddled walls of the canals were drainage holes to help disperse the water should the levels rise high enough. One of these was a drainage tube about 2 m wide and 50 m long, what we dubbed the butthole. The other end of the butthole led into the forest on the other side. As kids we would crawl through it and act like it was a portal to another dimension or it would take us back in time. James could not resist. "Dude, look, the butthole. I'm going in, man," he exclaimed. "I can't believe you actually said that out loud. Be careful, you're going to scrape your knees or bonk your head," I warned. Once he got further in, he stopped moving. "Any xenomorphs in there?" I asked. "Nah. You hear this frog, man?" Indeed, I could hear the thing from where I was standing. As I approached, I noticed the croak sounded guttural, throaty, and wet. If you've ever seen The Grudge, it sounded like the noise the girl makes, but not as drawn out. At that moment I just chalked it up to my imagination, alcohol intoxication, or a big frog, though my anxiety was already setting in. But what was strange was that there was a little water still running through the ditch from last week's rain, and typically where there was water, there were frogs. Though the croaks were coming from one source. Come to think of it, I do not recall any other noises, no bugs, no animals, no typical forest sounds. Dead silence except for the frog. "What's wrong with Kermit?" he said. "I don't know, man, just come out, I'm starting to lose my buzz." With that he scooted out backwards, still a bit tipsy. He fell on his way out, then stood up to face me. "I just got pooped out." We climbed out of the drainage ditch and continued along the dirt path. I could still hear the croaking, but it was faint. The sounds of insects and small critters rustling in the foliage eventually returned and filled the unnerving silence, the croaking becoming a distant memory, and I settled down a bit. It was a clear night, the moon was clearly visible, and stars dotted the sky, like tinsel strewn about a black canvas. The trees reaching tall, towering above us, and a nice cool breeze blowing the refreshing smell of pine to our nostrils. It was a few minutes before we arrived at the clearing that James broke the silence. "Hey man. What's up? Look, I am not sure how to even say this, but there's something I've been meaning to tell you, for a while now. It's been weighing heavy on my heart, and I just need to get it off my chest. Of course, you know it's just you and I out here, I'm here for you, man, you can tell me anything." "Thanks," he sighed. "It's just, lately I've been thinking I might. Whoa, dude, do you see that?" Wide-eyed, he pointed his finger ahead, I followed, and saw what he was seeing. A young buck, 10-pointer, still with velvet around the antlers. "Wow, he's beautiful," I said. We had a staring contest for about 5 minutes. Everything seemed normal about the deer, but most of its body was cloaked by the shadows casted by the trees overhead. What I could see was its head and a portion of its neck. It could have been the glare from the moon overhead, but the eyes looked glossed over, like thick cataracts, or like it had been dead for a while. It was also trembling, which could have been because of us. The tips of the antlers I can remember clearly too, the way the moonlight gleamed off them, like the surface was glossy. I tried to take a step closer, and then suddenly the buck sprinted off into the woods. It looked like right before the buck ran off, the antlers twitched, like fingers clenching to form a fist, but I brushed that off too, trying to stave my anxiety once more, and we started walking again. I really should have turned back at this point. After an additional 3 minutes, we had arrived at the clearing. James and I began walking to the middle. There we lie down on our backs, staring up at the sky. We were far enough from the city where light pollution wasn't visible. We could see a portion of the Milky Way galaxy, and the moon was in its waning gibbous phase. This almost would have been a perfect night for the telescope. In hindsight, I am glad we didn't bring it because it was heavy and might have weighed me down. "Okay," I said, "you didn't finish what you were going to say back there. What's going on with you?" "Oh yeah, right, well, I'm thinking about moving to." Before he could even finish, he was interrupted by a scream. It sounded like a young girl if I had to guess around the age of 10. "Help, help me, who's there?" I could not move my body, I couldn't even speak. I felt bad that I wasn't jumping into action, but for reasons I couldn't understand at the time, I was paralyzed. A primal fear had awoken in me, and I could only manage to turn my head slowly towards James, our gaze locked. It felt like hours had passed. I broke out in a cold sweat and had trouble swallowing. My words kept catching in my throat, but eventually I managed to form words and spoke to James in a low whisper. "What should we do? Call the police? They'd never get here in time, and how do we explain where we are?" "Yes, officer, we are in some woods, there's dirt and rocks." "She sounds hurt, we might need to help her ourselves," he reasoned. James was the first to get up. Once he did, he extended his hand out to me and hoisted me up. The direction of the scream had come from our right, a little way past the tree line. We waited a while longer to see if the girl would call out again. "I think we should head over there, call out to her, she might be lost or hurt, man," James said. "I don't know, something doesn't feel right, don't you feel weird about this?" I questioned. "It's probably the booze, man, regardless of how this feels we need to go over there." We took a few careful steps towards the tree line. Before we got within 3 feet of the first tree, we heard a noise that has scarred me indefinitely for the rest of my life. For context, when I was younger, me and my friends would love to jump off the swing set at its peak because it gave us the sensation of flying. One time I managed to get some good height before I let go, but I botched the landing and all my weight landed on my right shoulder. It had become dislocated, and I had to go to the hospital to have it popped back into its place. I am not sure if you all ever had something like that happen to you, but the noise from the shoulder bone being reinserted back into the socket is disgusting, you'd never forget it. This noise was similar, but incredibly loud, and wet. I could hear the bones shifting and adjusting even from this distance, muscles, tissues, and sinew being torn with the sound of wet fabric ripping. Then a rustling of leaves and brush, followed by silence. Once again frozen by fear, we could only wait for what would happen next. A voice called out to us, voices to be precise. The girl's voice, but 2 other voices spoke with it at the same time and with the same cadence. One being a significantly lower pitch, the other sounded like my own. "Stop, that hurts, wow, he's beautiful." Hearing my own words and voice was enough. I pissed out the liquor all over myself in that moment. I don't know much about trauma and how the human brain reacts, but what happened next comes back to me only in fragments. Thinking about it too hard always results in a panic attack. I remember multiple gaunt limbs, a misshapen head with horns, matted and patchy blonde hair, tall and lanky body with saggy leathery skin, pustules all over. I remember it running towards us on all 4s, body turned sideways. Then came the gunshots, running through the woods. I remember hearing a deer bleat mixed with the sound of a death rattle of a dying old man. And the rest is a blur, but I remember waking up in my own bed. I haven't seen James since that night. Anytime I would reach out to him there's no reply and his phone goes straight to voicemail. I want to know if that was real or if we were just drunk and imagining things. I'm thankful he was carrying his firearm that night because I'm not sure if we would have made it back, but I don't understand why he won't talk to me. I just feel crazy. What was that thing? Has anyone else encountered something similar in the area? I've heard of things called skinwalkers from the forums on here. Could that be what that was? It was capable of mimicry, albeit not particularly good. I received a text message from James today, and it was one of the reasons I decided to share. It simply read, "You left me." Sixth story. This story was shared by u/br34kf4s7. My friend's Skinwalker story. Back in college, a buddy and I were hanging out in our dorm room, smoking some weed and chilling. We get on the topic of creepypastas and stuff, and I mention that I've heard some really creepy Skinwalker stories. My buddy gets really quiet out of nowhere. "I saw one, once. Up close and personal. That shit is real, bro." Of course I asked him to tell me more. He said he didn't like talking about it, but eventually opened up. So his story took place back in the summer before he left for college. Him and his high school friend group had planned a big, last hurrah, camping trip. He was from Scottsdale, Arizona, and I think he said they only drove a good hour and a half outside the city, to one of their friends' parents' ranching properties. There's about 8 people in their group and everyone shows up around the same time in 3 separate cars. Around when they show up, it's already starting to get dark, so they set up their tents and a campfire and start drinking and smoking. This one dude in their group, let's call him Tim, is being a little more quiet than usual. My buddy asks him what's wrong and he says something like, "I don't feel good, just a little under the weather today." Regardless, they start making brats and are all having a good time. Then out of nowhere, everyone notices Tim is gone. Just totally vanished. Nobody even saw him leave even though everyone was relatively close to the fire. The group starts calling his name, thinking he's pranking everyone. Then they start to get worried once Tim has been gone for over an hour. So my friend and a couple others go out into the hills to search for him. They walk around for a good 15 minutes calling his name before they finally get a response. It's not Tim. Instead, they hear the familiar howl of a coyote. And it's answered by a couple other coyotes. My buddy says he was a little worried at this point that Tim might have gotten dragged off by the wild animals. Everyone in their group was paranoid because there's no way Tim could have gone missing without anyone noticing, just no way. They hear another howl, suddenly. It's longer than the others. And different in that it sounds off, like if someone had a recording of a coyote howling and decided to play it. My friend's blood ran cold when the howl ended in a sort of hacking laughter. And unlike the howl, the laughter sounded close. Like, 20 feet away close. The group starts frantically looking around, convinced Tim is out there fucking with them. He isn't. They don't see anyone. They return to the fire a little shaken up. Everyone is really starting to get worried at this point. The group starts considering calling the police when suddenly a truck pulls up to the campsite. It's Tim's truck. Tim steps out of it and is wondering why everyone has been freaking out. Tim says he's sorry, he got off work 2 hours late and hurried out to the ranch as fast as he could. This is when the group realizes that Tim didn't carpool there with anyone. As if on cue, they hear another long, drawn-out howl just like the other one. At that point the group noped the fuck out of there. They ended up paying to camp in a designated campground and the night went on as normal. But my friend still says he thinks about when he asked Tim if he was alright. He claims that at the time he could definitely tell something was off about Tim but didn't think anything of it. But now he's 100% convinced that Tim was some sort of skinwalker entity impersonating his friend for shits and giggles. How the creature knew what Tim looked and sounded like, well, he has no explanation for that. Maybe it just got inside their heads. 7th story. This story was shared by u/Jewel053. There's a skinwalker in my neighborhood. I had heard of skinwalkers before, but always just assumed they were the Native American version of werewolves, so I never gave them much thought. Until last week when one of the co-workers at my new job told me that they were his most feared folklore creatures. He's originally from Utah, so that makes sense. He suggested some YouTube videos to watch on the subject, and after work that night I binged about 4 or 5 of the videos. I totally understand his stance on them now. I live in rural South Carolina, so to be completely honest, I wasn't too worried about the possibility of running into one. My coworker told me that they're basically a Midwestern thing. I'd be more worried about Wendigos if I were you. He joked the day after I watched the videos. We had a good chat about skinwalkers and Wendigos during our shift and just reveled in the creepiness of them. I mentioned how one of the tales said that the more you talk about skinwalkers, the more they're drawn to you, and he made sarcastic ghost noises to keep the mood light. That night I showed the videos to my fiancée. She was way more creeped out than I was. I became kind of obsessed. I love scary things and couldn't help but watch every video I came across. I discussed skinwalkers with my other horror enthusiast friends, looked up skinwalker art, read true skinwalker stories on Reddit, just dove headfirst into all things skinwalker. This went on for a few days until I started feeling a little burned out on the subject. I live in a fairly nice neighborhood where all the houses are on one side of the street. On the other side is property that used to belong to the local elementary school. The building is on the next street over, so basically it was like the school's backyard or whatever. The school shut down about 30 or 40 years ago, and the county just let nature reclaim them. So directly across from my house is an old chain link fence and just overgrown woods. 2 nights ago while I was smoking a cigarette, I heard leaves rustling across the street. I didn't bother looking up from my phone. I live across from woods, it was probably a deer. The rustling stopped, then started again, and it sounded like whatever was over there was running back and forth along the fence line, panting like a dog. This caught my attention. There had been a few rabies cases in my town 2 months back, so a strange dog running around in the middle of the night was definitely something I'd want to keep an eye on. I look up from my phone in the direction of the sounds and they just stop. It was like the thing knew I noticed it. I strained my eyes trying to see what it was, but it was obscured by the overgrowth. I didn't look away, must have stared at the spot for at least a minute. It didn't make another sound, didn't move again, so I knew it was still there. A chill ran down my spine and I began thinking of every skinwalker video I had watched over the last week, and I felt sick to my stomach. I quickly put out my cigarette and went inside. The next morning I took my dog out for a short walk. She's a pug zoo named Honey and is like my child. Me and my fiancé taught her that pee-pee poo-poo means it's time to go outside to potty. It's the cutest thing. Anyway, this particular morning I take her out to the front yard to do her business. She pees and then walks around sniffing for about 5 minutes before walking to the side of the street and sitting down. She's never done this before, so I was a little annoyed. I tugged on her leash lightly and tried to coax her back toward the house. "Come on, honey. Gotta poo-poo." She didn't budge. This dog could be stubborn sometimes, but this was something else. She tugged back against the leash and just stared across the street, sniffing the air occasionally. It was then that I realized she was staring at the exact spot that I heard the thing the night before. I got goosebumps and I quickly picked her up and began walking back to the house. As I got closer, I noticed something on the ground by my front steps. It was one of the Halloween decorations my fiancé had hung up on our house. Plastic black roses with plastic eyeballs and spiders on them. The stems were wire so they can be wrapped around things to keep them secured. This flower was torn apart. Something had come onto my porch, taken down the flower, and torn it apart, leaving it lying in front of my steps. I picked up the flower and threw it away. I didn't tell my fiancé, I didn't want her freaking out. The rest of that day went by uneventfully. That night I told my coworker about what happened, and he looked a little concerned but brushed it off. Said what I heard was most likely just a dog and the flower was probably knocked down by the wind. I had my doubts. As I was walking to my door after getting home from work last night, I heard that same panting as the night before, and the clicking of claws against asphalt. I turned quickly to see a dog that looked like a brown mangy bull terrier hauling ass down my street. The street is probably about 40 feet away from my front porch, so I couldn't get a great look at it, but I could tell it was only running on 3 legs because one looked mangled. It turned quickly and darted into the tree line across the street through a part of the fence that had been pulled back. The fence wasn't like that earlier that day. That's when I noticed that the dog didn't have a tail. I almost threw up. Skinwalker legends say that when they take the form of an animal, they never have tails. I tried to rationalize it to myself. Maybe it just had a stub tail that I missed because it was running. I immediately went inside. My fiancée was sitting on the couch petting Honey. She could see I was upset and asked me what was wrong. I told her nothing, just almost got clipped by a car before I pulled into the driveway. She got up, hugged me, and cursed the person that almost hit me. She asked me if I could take Honey out for pee-pee poo-poo, because she had been creeped out by all the spooky videos we've been watching and didn't feel comfortable going outside at night by herself. Honey perked up. She ran to the door and looked between me and the door, whining excitedly. I stared down at her for a moment before agreeing to it. I'll just keep her close to the porch, I thought. We walked off the porch and she immediately tried to walk to the street. I tugged on the leash and she tugged back. She eventually moseyed to the edge of the porch and peed. After, she began walking around sniffing. I told her the usual line. Come on, Honey. Gotta poo-poo. She huffed at me, sniffed around some more, and eventually started pooping. I was on edge the entire time we were outside, but being around her helped calm me down a little. Then I heard it from across the street. Come on, Honey. My voice, in the exact same tone and inflection as I had just said it. It sounded staticky, like an old radio broadcast. But it was definitely my voice. Honey stopped what she was doing and stood alert. She looked over to me and cocked her head. Come on, Honey. Gotta poo-poo. Again my voice called from across the street. Honey began whining, looking from me to the woods across the street. I picked her up and began backing up to the steps, not taking my eyes off the part of the fence that had been pulled back. Honey. Come. The voice sounded firm now, like it was getting aggravated. Honey squirmed in my arms, whining. I didn't know if she was trying to get out to go to the voice or to run inside, but I wasn't taking any chances. I turned and bolted up the steps and to the door. As I walked inside, I turned one last time to look across the street. There, standing in the part of the fence that was pulled back, was the dog. Its eyes were glowing a dull orange and it had its teeth bared. The face was all wrong, like someone had taken a distortion tool and just dragged around random features. Once again, I didn't tell my fiancée. Stupid horror movie cliché shit, I know. But I really don't want her losing her shit. I just told her there's a strange dog running around the neighborhood, so to not take honey out at night. Later last night after we had gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth outside my window. Against my better judgment I rolled over to try and see it. I don't, but the pacing stops. Come on. Honey. My voice called out, cutting through the quiet of the night. I prayed my fiancé didn't hear. It called out 2 more times before I heard it walking away. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. Today when I get to work, I'm going to ask my coworker what I can do to get rid of this thing. I'm scared. I don't think there's a way. If anyone knows anything, please let me know. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.